The summer of 1842 settled over Louisiana like a wet wool blanket, thick and suffocating. Along the banks of the Mississippi River, where the water moved slow and dark as molasses, the Belmont plantation stretched across 1,500 acres of cotton fields that seemed to have no end. The mansion itself rose white and pristine against the green, its columns gleaming in the merciless sun. A monument to wealth built on the backs of 240 souls who worked the land from dawn until their bodies gave out. Joshua was 28 years old that summer, though he looked older. The Louisiana sun had carved lines into his face that shouldn't have been there for another decade, and his hands bore the permanent stains and calluses of a man who had known nothing but labor since he could walk. He had been born on Belmont land, delivered by his mother in a cabin so small you could barely turn around in it, and he had never known a single day of freedom. But Joshua was different from many of the others, and everyone knew it. He could read, a secret his mother had died protecting, teaching him letters by candlelight in those precious hours between exhaustion and sleep. He could write too, though he hid this skill like a weapon he might one day need. And he could think, really think, in ways that made him dangerous to men like Edmund Belmont. Before we continue with Joshua's story, if you're finding this narrative gripping, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about survival and justice. Don't miss a single moment. Edmund Belmont was the plantation's master, a man of 45 with soft hands and a hard heart. He had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through what he called efficient management, which meant working people until they broke and then replacing them. He fancied himself a gentleman, a man of culture and refinement, but his refinement was a thin veneer over something rotten. He kept meticulous records of every bale of cotton, every bushel of corn, every dollar spent and earned. And he kept equally meticulous records of every punishment administered, every escape attempt, every act of what he called defiance. Joshua worked in the big house, which should have been a blessing but felt more like a curse. He served at table, polished silver, tended the fires, and heard everything. He heard Edmund Belmont and his overseer, a cruel man named Silas Crawford, discuss their plans. He heard them laugh about the people they owned, as if they were discussing livestock. And he heard something else too, something that made his blood run cold and his mind race with terrible calculations. Belmont was in financial trouble, deep trouble. The cotton market had collapsed that spring, and he had borrowed heavily against the next harvest. Now the banks were circling, and Edmund Belmont was desperate. Joshua had overheard a conversation 3 nights earlier that kept playing in his mind like a curse he couldn't shake. Belmont and Crawford had been drinking whiskey in the study, their voices carrying through the walls. "The insurance," Belmont had said, his words slightly slurred. "If something happened to the quarters, to the equipment, the loss would be substantial. Covered, of course." Crawford had laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Accidents happen, Mr. Belmont, especially in summer. Everything's so dry." Joshua had stood frozen in the hallway, a silver tray trembling in his hands, understanding blooming in his chest like poison flowers. They were planning to burn the slave quarters, collect the insurance money, and the people inside, Joshua's people, his community, everyone he had ever known, would be considered property loss. Nothing more. Chapter 2. The Warning. Joshua didn't sleep that night. He lay on his narrow pallet in the servants' room attached to the big house, staring at the ceiling and listening to the cicadas sing their endless summer song. His mind worked through possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. He could warn people. But who would believe him? And even if they did, what could they do? Running meant dogs, meant patrols, meant almost certain death or capture, and something worse than death. Staying silent meant watching everyone burn. There was no good choice, only gradations of horror. By dawn, Joshua had made his decision. He would tell Isaiah, the oldest man in the quarters, someone people listened to and respected. Isaiah had been on Belmont land for 53 years, had survived 3 different masters, and had a way of seeing through lies that bordered on prophetic. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Joshua served breakfast, polished boots, carried water, all while his heart hammered against his ribs like something trying to escape. Edmund Belmont was in high spirits, laughing at his own jokes, discussing his plans to travel to New Orleans the following week. Silas Crawford sat at the table too, shoveling eggs into his mouth and grinning like a man with a secret. That evening, after the last lamp was lit and the last dish cleaned, Joshua slipped out of the big house. The quarters were a quarter-mile away, a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in neat rows like grave markers. Cooking fires glowed in the dusk, and the smell of cornbread and greens drifted on the humid air. Children played in the dirt, their laughter a sound so pure it made Joshua's chest ache. He found Isaiah sitting outside his cabin smoking a pipe and watching the sky turn from purple to black. The old man's face was a landscape of wrinkles, each one a story of survival. When he saw Joshua approaching, something shifted in his expression. "You got trouble in your eyes, boy," Isaiah said without preamble. "Sit down and tell me." Joshua sat, and he told everything. The conversation he'd overheard, Belmont's debts, the insurance, the planned fire. Isaiah listened without interrupting, his pipe going cold in his hand. When Joshua finished, silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. "You sure about this?" Isaiah finally asked. "I'm sure." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Then we got a choice to make. We can try to run, some of us maybe, the young and strong. Leave the old, the children, the sick behind. Or we can stay and hope you heard wrong, hope that even a devil like Belmont wouldn't murder his own property." He paused, looking at Joshua with eyes that had seen too much. "Or we can prepare." "Prepare how?" "For fire, boy, for fire." Chapter 3. Preparations in Shadow. Over the next 3 days, Isaiah quietly spread the word to those he trusted most. Not everyone. There were informants in the quarters, people desperate enough to trade information for an extra ration of food or a lighter work assignment, but enough people. Enough to matter. They made preparations that looked like nothing at all. Women filled extra buckets with water, claiming they were for washing. Men cleared brush away from cabin walls, saying they were tidying up. Children were instructed on the fastest routes to the river, told it was a game. Everything had to appear normal while they prepared for catastrophe. Joshua watched Edmund Belmont like a hawk watches a snake. The master was distracted, anxious, drinking more than usual. He snapped at servants, paced the halls at night, and spent long hours locked in his study with his account books. Silas Crawford came and went at odd hours, and Joshua noticed him studying the quarters from a distance, calculating something. On the 4th day, Joshua was serving dinner when he heard Belmont tell his wife that he would be traveling to Baton Rouge the next evening. "Business matters," he said. He'd be gone overnight. His wife, a pale woman who floated through the house like a ghost, merely nodded. She never asked questions. Joshua suspected she knew more than she admitted, but had made peace with her ignorance long ago. That night, Joshua went to the quarters again. He found Isaiah and the others, 12 men and women who formed the core of their desperate plan, gathered in the darkest space between 2 cabins. "Tomorrow night," Joshua whispered. "Belmont leaves at dusk. That's when Crawford will do it." A woman named Ruth, who worked in the laundry and had arms like iron from years of scrubbing, spoke up. "We got buckets positioned, got the children briefed, but if he sets multiple fires, then we fight multiple fires," Isaiah said firmly. "And if it gets too big, we run. Everyone heads to the river. We scatter in the water, make it hard for the dogs." "That's suicide," said a young man named Thomas. "They'll hunt us all down." "Maybe," Isaiah acknowledged, "but burning alive is certain death. Running gives us a chance. Small, but a chance." Joshua felt the weight of what they were planning settle on his shoulders. They weren't just preparing to survive a fire. They were preparing to resist, to refuse to die quietly. And that resistance, no matter how it ended, would have consequences that would ripple far beyond Belmont Plantation. But Chapter 4. The Night of Flames. The next day moved like a funeral procession, slow, inevitable, heavy with dread. Joshua went through his duties in the big house with mechanical precision, his mind elsewhere. He watched Edmund Belmont prepare for his journey, loading a small trunk into his carriage. The master was nervous, checking his pocket watch repeatedly, glancing toward the quarters. Just before sunset, Belmont climbed into his carriage. Silas Crawford stood nearby, and Joshua watched them exchange a look, brief, meaningful, confirming. Then Belmont was gone, rolling down the oak-lined drive in a cloud of dust. Crawford waited exactly 1 hour. Joshua, watching from an upstairs window, saw the overseer emerge from his house as full darkness fell. He carried something wrapped in cloth, and he moved with purpose toward the equipment barn near the quarters. Joshua's heart stopped. Then he ran. He burst out of the big house, not caring who saw him, sprinting across the grounds toward the quarters. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Belmont calling out in confusion, but he didn't stop. His legs pumped, his breath burned, and the humid night air felt thick as water. He was shouting before he reached the quarters. "Fire! He's setting fire! Everyone up now!" People poured from their cabins, confused, frightened. Isaiah emerged, saw Joshua's face, and immediately started organizing. "Women and children to the river! Men, grab the buckets! Move!" Then the night exploded with light. The equipment barn went up like it had been soaked in lamp oil, which Joshua realized it probably had been. Flames shot 30 feet into the air, and the heat hit like a physical blow. But Crawford hadn't stopped there. As Joshua watched in horror, he saw the overseer running between cabins, touching his torch to dry wood, and suddenly the night was full of fire. Chaos erupted. People scattered in every direction, some toward the river, some trying to fight the flames with their pitiful buckets of water. Children screamed. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, and through it all, Joshua could hear Silas Crawford laughing, a sound of pure madness. Joshua grabbed a bucket and threw water on the nearest cabin, but it was pointless. The fire was too big, too hot, spreading too fast. He saw Ruth pulling 2 children away from the flames, saw Thomas trying to save an elderly man who could barely walk. Everywhere was heat and smoke and terror. Then he saw her, a girl, no more than 6 years old, trapped in a cabin that was fully engulfed. She stood at the window, screaming, her face a mask of pure fear. Joshua didn't think. He grabbed a wet blanket someone had dropped, wrapped it around himself, and ran straight into the burning cabin. Chapter 5. Into the Inferno. The heat inside the cabin was indescribable, a living thing that wanted to consume him, to reduce him to ash and memory. Joshua couldn't breathe, couldn't see through the smoke. His eyes streamed tears, and the wet blanket over his head was already starting to steam. "Where are you?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Call out!" A small cry came from his left. Joshua stumbled toward it, his hands outstretched, touching burning wood that seared his palms. He found her huddled in a corner, frozen with fear. Without hesitation, he scooped her up, wrapped her in the blanket with him, and turned back toward where he thought the door should be. But the smoke was too thick. He was disoriented, lungs screaming for clean air. He stumbled, fell, felt flames licking at his legs. The child was crying against his chest, and he held her tighter, thinking, "This is it. This is where it ends." Then hands grabbed him. Thomas had come in after him, had found them somehow through the inferno. Together, they crashed through the cabin door and out into the night, rolling in the dirt to extinguish the flames that clung to their clothes. Joshua coughed until he thought his lungs would tear apart. Someone poured water over him. When his vision finally cleared, he saw the child being carried away by her mother, both of them crying. He'd saved her, but the cost was written on his body. Burns covering his arms and legs, his skin blistered and raw. Around him, the quarters were an apocalypse. 5 cabins fully engulfed, 3 more catching. People running everywhere, trying to save what little they had, trying to save each other. And somewhere in the chaos, Silas Crawford had disappeared. Isaiah appeared at Joshua's side, his face smudged with soot. "We need to get you to the river. Those burns—" "No!" Joshua gasped out. "We need to—" He broke off into another coughing fit. But Isaiah understood. They needed to contain this, to keep it from spreading to all the cabins. If they lost everything, everyone, Crawford and Belmont would collect their insurance and simply replace them with new slaves. The people of Belmont Plantation would be erased as if they'd never existed. "Everyone!" Isaiah roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop running! We fight this together or we all burn. Bucket lines, now!" And somehow, through the fear and pain, the community organized. Bucket lines formed from the well to the fires. People worked in synchronized desperation, passing water hand to hand. It wasn't enough to stop the flames, but it was enough to slow them, to create fire breaks, to save some of the cabins. Joshua worked despite his burns, despite the agony that screamed through every nerve. He worked because stopping meant accepting defeat, and he had never learned how to do that. Around him, people fought with everything they had, refusing to let the fire take everything. Hours passed. Gradually, impossibly, the flames began to die. When dawn finally broke, grey and smoke-filled, 7 cabins had been completely destroyed. 11 more were damaged, but 23 remained standing. And most importantly, everyone was alive, burned, traumatized, homeless, but alive. Joshua collapsed as the sun rose, his body finally giving out. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Isaiah's face, lined with soot and tears, looking down at him with something like wonder. "You crazy, brave fool," the old man whispered. "You beautiful, crazy fool." Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Joshua woke to pain. It surrounded him, lived in him, defined his entire existence. His burns had been wrapped in wet cloth by the plantation's healer, an old woman named Dinah, who knew more about keeping people alive than most doctors. But her herbs and poultices could only do so much. He was in one of the surviving cabins, lying on a pallet. Voices murmured around him, people checking on him, bringing water, offering prayers. He tried to speak, but could only manage a croak. "Don't talk," Dinah said, appearing above him with eyes that had seen 1,000 kinds of suffering. "You breathed in too much smoke. Your insides are burned almost as bad as your outsides. You need rest." "Crawford," Joshua managed to whisper. "Where?" "Gone. Disappeared into the night after he set the fires. But Belmont came back this morning." Her face hardened. "And he's putting on quite the performance." Joshua tried to sit up, but pain shot through him like lightning. Dinah pushed him back down firmly. "You're not going anywhere, not for days, maybe weeks. Now drink this." She held a bitter-tasting liquid to his lips, and Joshua drank. Within minutes, the pain began to recede, replaced by a strange floating sensation. As he drifted towards sleep, he heard raised voices outside, Edmund Belmont's voice, high and angry, and Isaiah's, steady and cold. When Joshua woke again, it was dark. Isaiah sat beside his pallet, his face illuminated by candlelight. "What happened?" Joshua asked, his voice slightly stronger. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. "Belmont's claiming it was an accident. A lamp knocked over, he says. Tragic, but unavoidable. He's already filed his insurance claim. Property damage, lost equipment, the whole thing. And Crawford, officially run off, couldn't handle the guilt of failing to prevent the fire." Isaiah's laugh was bitter as poison. "Belmont gave him money and a horse. Sent him away before anyone could ask too many questions." Joshua felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce, despite his weakness. "They're going to get away with it." "Maybe. Probably." Isaiah leaned forward. "But you did something last night, Joshua. You saved that child. You helped organize the bucket lines. You showed everyone that we don't have to die quietly, that we can fight back even against fire itself." He paused. "That matters. That memory matters. Memory won't rebuild those cabins, won't feed the people who lost everything. No, but Belmont has to rebuild. The insurance investigators are coming. He has to maintain the appearance that this was a tragic accident he's recovering from. So for now, we get new cabins, new supplies, and we get to watch him squirm while he pretends to be the generous master helping his poor slaves recover. Joshua closed his eyes. The injustice of it burned worse than his wounds. But Isaiah was right. They had survived, they had fought, and somehow that would have to be enough. Over the following weeks, Joshua slowly healed. His burns scarred over, leaving permanent marks across his arms and legs, a map of the night he'd run into fire and come out alive. The insurance investigators came and went, apparently satisfied with Belmont's story. New cabins were built, cheaper and shoddier than the ones that had burned. Life on the plantation resumed its brutal rhythm. But something had changed. People looked at Joshua differently now. They saw him as someone who had faced death and refused to yield. And Joshua felt something stirring in himself too, a refusal to accept that this was all his life would ever be. He began planning. Carefully, secretly, he started to prepare for something he'd never dared consider before: escape. Down Zadakashan Chapter 7, The Price of Freedom. Autumn came to Louisiana with little fanfare. The oppressive heat merely shifted to a different kind of oppression, the humidity clinging like a second skin. Joshua's burns had healed into thick, ropey scars that ached when rain was coming. He wore them like medals he couldn't remove, reminders of both what he'd survived and what he'd lost. Edmund Belmont had received his insurance money. Joshua knew because he'd seen the papers in the study, had read them while supposedly dusting. $53,000, enough to cover the property damage and then some. The master was flush with cash again, his financial troubles temporarily solved through the deliberate destruction of his slaves' homes. The injustice of it was a stone Joshua carried in his chest, growing heavier each day. But Joshua had learned something important during his months of recovery. Rage could be fuel if you controlled it, poison if you didn't. So he channeled his anger into preparation. He saved scraps of food. He studied the patrol routes. He listened to other slaves talk about the Underground Railroad, those whispered stories of people who'd made it north, who'd touched freedom and lived to tell about it. And he made a decision that terrified him. He would run. Not alone. That would be suicide. But with a small group, people he trusted, people who were willing to risk everything for the possibility of freedom. He approached Ruth first. The laundress had lost her sister in the fire, not to flames, but to the shock and grief that followed. Ruth had a hardness to her now, a willingness to do whatever it took to escape the hell of Belmont Plantation. "You're serious about this," she said when Joshua laid out his plan. They were by the river, supposedly washing clothes, speaking in whispers beneath the sound of water. "Dead serious. I've been mapping the patrols, saving supplies. In 2 weeks there's a new moon, darkest night of the month." 2 weeks isn't much time. It's all we've got. Belmont's planning to sell 12 people next month to cover some new investment. If we wait, some of us might not be here to run. Ruth was quiet, beating a shirt against the washing stone with mechanical precision. Finally she nodded. "I'm in. Who else?" "Thomas. Maybe 3 others. Small group moves faster, quieter." "And where do we go?" Joshua pulled out something he'd stolen from Belmont's study. A map, carefully copied onto a piece of cloth during a night when the master was drunk and sleeping. "North, there's a Quaker family near Natchez that helps people. If we can make it there, they'll get us farther up the line. That's 80 miles through swamp and patrol territory." "I know." Ruth looked at him with something like respect. "You really think we can make it?" "I think we die here if we stay. At least running gives us a chance." Over the next 2 weeks, Joshua quietly recruited his group. Thomas agreed immediately. The young man had been talking about escape since the fire, his faith in any kind of justice completely shattered. 2 women named Hannah and Pearl joined them, both field workers with strong backs and stronger wills. And finally, against Joshua's better judgment, a boy named Marcus insisted on coming. He was only 16, but his master had recently started eyeing him for sale, and his desperation outweighed Joshua's concerns. They gathered supplies in tiny increments: dried meat, cornbread, a knife, rope, a stolen compass from the big house. Everything was hidden in the woods near the river, buried in a waterproof sack. They memorized landmarks, practiced moving silently, and waited for the new moon. The night before they were set to run, Isaiah pulled Joshua aside. "I know what you're planning," the old man said without preamble. Joshua's heart stopped. "I don't know what you—" "Don't lie to me, boy. I see everything that happens in these quarters. You think 6 people can prepare to run without me noticing?" Joshua said nothing, calculating how much danger they were in. If Isaiah told Belmont, "I'm not going to stop you," Isaiah continued. "Hell, I'd go with you if these bones could make the journey, but I need you to understand something." He gripped Joshua's shoulder, his fingers surprisingly strong. "When you run, Belmont's going to take it out on those of us who stay. He'll assume we knew, that we helped. People will suffer because you chose freedom." The words hit Joshua like a physical blow. "Then tell me not to go. Tell me to stay." "I can't do that either." "Because if you make it, if you survive and tell your story, that matters too. It means something that one of us got out, that one of us refused to die here." Isaiah's eyes were wet. "Just promise me something." "What?" "Remember us, the ones who stayed, who couldn't run. Remember that we lived, that we mattered. Don't let our names disappear into history like we were never here." Joshua pulled the old man into an embrace, both of them holding on like drowning men. "I promise. I swear to God, I promise." The next night, under a moonless sky so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, 6 people slipped away from Belmont Plantation and into the uncertain darkness beyond. Chapter 8. The Pursuit. They made good time the first night. Following the river north and covering nearly 15 miles before dawn forced them to find shelter. Joshua had scouted this route in his mind 100 times, but the reality was harder. Thorns tore at their clothes, mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, and every sound in the darkness could be a patrol or a slave catcher's dog. They hid in a cypress swamp as the sun rose, waist-deep in murky water, breathing through reeds and praying the snakes would leave them alone. From their hiding spot, they heard riders pass on the road, 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, searching. Belmont had discovered their absence quickly. "How did he know so fast?" Pearl whispered, her teeth chattering from cold despite the humid air. "Someone told him," Thomas said darkly. "Had to be. We weren't supposed to be missed until the morning work call." Joshua felt sick. One of the others in the quarters must have seen something, said something, or maybe Isaiah had been forced to reveal what he knew. Either way, the hunters were already after them, and they'd barely begun. They stayed in the swamp all day, taking turns sleeping while the others kept watch. Hannah developed a fever, her body shaking violently. They fed her willow bark tea that Ruth prepared, but her eyes had a glassy quality that terrified Joshua. If she got worse, they'd have to make an impossible choice, slow down and risk everyone, or leave her behind. When night fell again, they moved. Hannah could barely walk, so Thomas carried her on his back, an act of kindness that would cost them precious speed. They followed deer trails through thick forest, navigating by the stolen compass and Joshua's memorized map. Every mile felt like 10, and Joshua knew they weren't covering enough ground. On the 3rd night, they heard the dogs. The sound came from behind them, still distant but unmistakable, the baying of hounds on a scent. Slave catcher dogs, trained to track human beings, to tear apart anyone who ran. "Move faster," Joshua urged, but everyone was exhausted, pushed beyond their limits. Marcus was limping from a twisted ankle. Hannah was delirious with fever. They were falling apart. "We need to split up," Ruth said suddenly. "Split the scent trail. Some of us go east, some stay north. Confuse the dogs." "That's suicide," Thomas protested. "We stay together. Together, we're all dead. Split up, some of us might make it." Joshua knew she was right, and he hated it. This was the nightmare scenario he'd feared, the group fragmenting, everyone dying alone in the wilderness. But the dogs were getting closer, and they had no choice. "Ruth and Pearl, head east toward Wilkinson County. There's supposed to be sympathetic people there." "Thomas, You take Hannah north to Natchez. Me and Marcus will stay on this trail, try to draw the dogs." "That's not fair to you," Thomas said. "Fair doesn't exist. Go, now." They separated in the darkness, 6 people becoming 3 pairs, each heading into uncertain fate. Joshua and Marcus pushed north at a punishing pace, deliberately leaving obvious trail markers, broken branches, disturbed earth. Behind them, the dogs grew louder. "They're gaining," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "I know. Keep moving." But Marcus was young, and terror had him in its grip. When they hit a fork in the trail an hour later, the boy panicked. Instead of following Joshua's lead, he broke east, running blindly into the woods. "Marcus, no!" Joshua shouted, but the boy was gone, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Joshua faced an impossible choice: follow Marcus and try to save him, or continue north alone and trust the boy would survive. The dogs were close now, so close he could hear men's voices behind them, excited and cruel. He chose to follow Marcus. It was irrational, strategically stupid, probably fatal. But Joshua had run into fire to save a child once before, and he couldn't stop being the kind of man who ran toward danger when someone needed help. He found Marcus cornered against a ravine, 3 dogs circling him, their teeth bared and gleaming in the faint starlight. Behind them came the slave catchers, 2 white men with rifles and whips, grinning like they'd just won a prize. Joshua didn't think. He grabbed a heavy branch and charged, screaming like a madman, bringing the wood down on the nearest dog with all his strength. The animal yelped and scattered. The second dog lunged at Joshua, catching his arm in its jaws, tearing through cloth and skin. Pain exploded through him, but he kept fighting, kept swinging, kept screaming. A rifle shot cracked through the night. Marcus jerked and fell, blood blooming across his chest. "No!" Joshua roared, and he threw himself at the man who'd fired, all reason abandoned. They went down in a tangle of limbs, and Joshua's hands found the man's throat. He squeezed and squeezed, watching the man's eyes bulge with satisfying terror. Then something hard crashed into the back of Joshua's skull, and the world exploded into stars and darkness. Chapter 9. The Return. Joshua woke in hell. At least, that's what he thought at first. Everything was fire and pain and the smell of his own flesh burning. Then his vision cleared slightly, and he realized he was back at Belmont Plantation, tied to the whipping post in front of the big house. Edmund Belmont stood before him, his face twisted with rage. Behind him stood Silas Crawford, who had apparently returned from his convenient absence. And surrounding them was every enslaved person from the plantation, forced to watch what happened to those who ran. "You killed one of my slave catchers," Belmont said, his voice shaking. "Crushed his windpipe. He died choking on his own blood." Joshua said nothing. His throat was too dry, his head still spinning from the blow that had knocked him unconscious. In his peripheral vision he could see Isaiah in the crowd, the old man's face a mask of grief. "The boy you were with, Marcus, he died too. Bled out before we could get him back. That's 2 deaths on your hands, Joshua. 2. Belmont stepped closer. "I should kill you. Legally, I have every right, but I'm not going to. You know why?" Joshua managed to shake his head. "Because I want you to suffer. I want you to live with what you've done, with the knowledge that everyone you tried to save is either dead or caught. Thomas and Hannah were found this morning. She died of fever in the night, and he was right beside her, refusing to leave her body. Ruth and Pearl made it 3 more miles before the dogs got them." Belmont's smile was poisonous. "You failed, Joshua. Completely and utterly failed, and now you're going to pay." What followed was methodical brutality. 50 lashes with a whip that tore through skin and muscle, each one counted aloud by Silas Crawford. Joshua screamed until his voice gave out. And then he screamed silently, his body convulsing with each strike. He felt himself dying, felt his consciousness trying to escape the destroyed shell of his body. But he didn't die. Dinah was brought in to patch him up, to keep him alive so his suffering could continue. For 3 days, Joshua existed in a fever dream of pain, his back a landscape of torn flesh and infection. People whispered that he wouldn't survive, that his body couldn't possibly heal from such damage. On the fourth day, something remarkable happened. Joshua's fever broke. His wounds, which should have killed him through infection, began to close. Dinah called it a miracle. Others called it unnatural, but Joshua simply called it rage, a refusal to give Belmont the satisfaction of his death. Over the following months, Joshua healed, but something had changed in him. The man who had run into fire to save others, who had tried to lead people to freedom, had been burned away. What remained was harder, colder, focused on a single purpose: revenge. He worked in silence, never speaking unless directly addressed. He watched Edmund Belmont with eyes that held no fear, only calculation. And he began to plan again, not escape this time, but something else. Something that would ensure Belmont paid for every life he'd destroyed. A year passed, then another. Joshua's scars became a permanent part of him, his story a warning to others about the futility of resistance. Belmont believed he'd broken Joshua completely, had turned him into a cautionary tale. Belmont was wrong. In the summer of 1845, 3 years after the first fire, Joshua made his move. He'd been patient, observing, learning, waiting for the perfect moment. And that moment came when Belmont hosted a celebration, a harvest party, with guests from neighboring plantations, music and dancing, and liberal amounts of alcohol flowing through the big house. While everyone was distracted, Joshua did something very simple. He'd learned from the first fire, learned that obvious arson brought investigators and questions. So this time, he was subtle. He didn't set fires. He created the conditions for an accident. Lamp oil spilled in the cellar, soaking into old wood. Candles placed just close enough to curtains to be dangerous. Kitchen fires left unattended. Over the course of the evening, Joshua moved through the big house like a ghost, setting the stage for catastrophe. When the fire started just after midnight, it seemed like tragic misfortune. Multiple small fires, spreading quickly, catching the drunk and sleeping inhabitants by surprise. People fled into the night in their nightclothes, screaming and confused. Joshua stood in the quarters, watching the big house burn. This time he'd made sure no one from the quarters would be blamed. This time he'd made sure only those who deserved to burn were in danger. Edmund Belmont made it out alive, along with most of his guests. But the house itself was destroyed. 200 years of wealth and history reduced to ash and memory. And the insurance company, suspicious of a second major fire on the same property, refused to pay out. Belmont was ruined, completely and utterly ruined. He'd have to sell everything, including the enslaved people he'd tortured and controlled. Joshua would be sold away, sent somewhere else, but he didn't care. He'd won. In the only way that mattered, he'd won. Chapter 10. The Flames' Judgment. The auction was held on a cold November morning in 1845. 217 people stood on the block in Natchez, waiting to be sold like cattle. Joshua was among them, his scarred body a testament to everything he'd survived. Edmund Belmont watched from the sidelines, a broken man clutching the meager proceeds from the sale, knowing it wouldn't be enough to save him from his creditors. Joshua was purchased by a cotton merchant from Memphis for $800. A low price for a man his age, but the scars made buyers nervous. They wondered if he was damaged goods, if the body that had survived so much abuse could still perform labor. They had no idea what he truly was. A man who had learned that survival itself could be a form of resistance, that bearing witness to atrocity and living to tell the tale was its own kind of victory. As Joshua was led away in chains, he looked back at Edmund Belmont one last time. Their eyes met across the auction yard, and Joshua saw the truth written in the master's broken expression. Belmont knew who had destroyed him. He knew that Joshua had taken everything, had reduced him to the same helpless poverty that the enslaved experienced every day. And he could do nothing about it, because to admit Joshua's revenge was to admit his own crimes. Joshua's new master was named William Crawford, no relation to Silas, and he turned out to be a different kind of man entirely. Still a slaveholder, still complicit in the evil of the institution, but not actively cruel. He allowed Joshua a small degree of autonomy, recognized his intelligence, and employed him as a clerk rather than a field hand. In this new environment, Joshua began to write. In stolen moments, using scraps of paper and borrowed ink, he documented everything: the fire of 1842, the attempted escape, the revenge he'd taken. He wrote about Marcus and Hannah and Ruth and Pearl, about Isaiah and Dinah and all the others. He gave them names, stories, humanity. He made them real on paper in a way that history would have otherwise erased. His writings were discovered in 1847 by a traveling abolitionist who befriended Joshua and recognized the power of his testimony. The abolitionist smuggled Joshua north during the chaos of a yellow fever outbreak, spiriting him away to freedom in Illinois. There, Joshua's story was published as a pamphlet, The Slave Who Survived Fire. It became a sensation in abolitionist circles, passed from hand to hand, read aloud at meetings. Joshua's account of deliberate arson for insurance money, of brutal reprisals, of systematic cruelty and the courage required to resist. It moved people in ways that abstract arguments never could. His story became evidence, became ammunition in the growing war against slavery. Joshua lived to see the Civil War begin in 1861. By then, he was a man of 47, still bearing the scars of fire and whip, still haunted by the faces of those who hadn't survived. He volunteered for the Union Army despite his age and fought with a ferocity that scared even his fellow soldiers. When the war ended and the slaves were freed, Joshua returned to Louisiana. He was 51 years old, and he had one final task to complete. He traveled back to Belmont Plantation, or what remained of it. The land had been abandoned, the big house still a burned-out ruin, the quarters long empty. He found Isaiah's grave in a small cemetery near what used to be the quarters. The old man had died in 1849, 4 years after Joshua escaped. Someone had carved a simple marker: Isaiah, born 1789, died 1849, remembered. Joshua sat by the grave and told Isaiah everything. About the escape north, about the published story, about the war and freedom and justice finally coming, however imperfectly. He kept the promise he'd made in 1842. He had remembered, had ensured that the people of Belmont Plantation would not disappear from history. Then he did something he'd planned for 13 years. He planted a tree, a live oak sapling, the same kind that lined the old plantation drive. But this tree was different. This tree was planted in the center of where the quarters had stood, a living monument to those who had suffered and survived and died there. "This is for all of you," Joshua said to the empty air, to the ghosts that surrounded him. "So people will know, so they'll remember. You didn't die nameless, you mattered." Joshua lived another 23 years, until 1888. He never married, never had children of his own. Instead, he dedicated his life to documenting the stories of the formerly enslaved, collecting testimonies, and ensuring that the truth of slavery was recorded before those who had lived it were gone. When he died at the age of 74, his funeral was attended by hundreds, people whose stories he'd preserved, descendants of those he'd known, activists who'd been inspired by his testimony. He was buried in Illinois, but his heart, people said, remained in Louisiana with those he'd left behind. The tree he planted still stands today, a massive live oak over 150 years old. Local historians know its story, know that it was planted by a man named Joshua, who survived fire twice, once in his body, once in his soul, and refused to let the flames consume everything. His testimony survives too, preserved in libraries and archives, a first-hand account of the deliberate cruelty of slavery and the unbreakable human spirit. Scholars study his words, teachers share his story, and every year people visit that tree in Louisiana and remember Joshua, who ran into fire to save a child. Remember Marcus, who died too young, with hope still in his heart. Remember Ruth, Pearl, Thomas, and Hannah, who chose the risk of freedom over the certainty of bondage. Remember Isaiah, who stayed behind but ensured the runners were never forgotten. Remember all the nameless, faceless people who suffered under slavery's brutal regime, who resisted in ways large and small, who survived when survival itself was an act of defiance. Joshua's story isn't just about revenge, though revenge played its part. It's about bearing witness, about the power of testimony, about refusing to let history erase those who were considered property. It's about the long arc of justice, imperfect and incomplete, but bending slowly toward recognition of our shared humanity. The fire of 1842 was meant to destroy, but from its ashes grew something else, a record, a memory, a testament. Joshua became the flame's judgment, not through supernatural means, but through the most human power of all, the ability to remember, to tell stories, to ensure that truth outlives those who would bury it. And in the end, that memory burns brighter than any fire. This is the story that Louisiana tried to forget, a story of deliberate cruelty, impossible survival, and the revenge that took 13 years to complete. Joshua's testimony remains in archives today, a first-hand account of slavery's brutality and one man's refusal to die quietly. What would you have done in his place? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it. Because these are the stories that deserve to be told, remembered, and never forgotten.